Welcome to Alzheimer's disease episode 3. In this section, we discuss various known causes of Alzheimer's disease, age-related changes in the brain, genetic causes, environmental causes, air pollution, factors in our home, physical activity on the disease process, and the lifestyle factors which may lead to Alzheimer's disease. Of the known cause of Alzheimer's are environmental toxins, genetic causes, heavy metals, infective agents, oxygen starvation, sleep deprivation, head trauma, deficiencies, and some medications. The effect of aging on Alzheimer's disease. We wish to just establish here factually old age does not cause Alzheimer's disease, but it is the most important known risk factor for the disease. Let's highlight this difference. As one gets older, he of course will have some memory challenges, which does not equal Alzheimer's disease. Old age, therefore, does not equate to Alzheimer's disease, but Alzheimer's disease is found most frequently in the older age group population. Okay, so I hope you can understand this difference. The number of people with Alzheimer's disease doubles about every 5 years after you age 65. So after you reach age 65, if there was one person having the disease at age 65, it will be doubled by the time they reach 70. So every 5 years after age 65, the number of persons suffering from the disease doubles. Sadly, about 33% of people above age 85 may have Alzheimer's disease. So about 1 in 3 persons after age 85 is likely to have Alzheimer's disease. Could it be that age-related changes in the brain cause harm to some neurons which may affect other types of brain cells, contributing to brain damage that eventually develops into Alzheimer's disease? We don't know. It may be. We don't know. We just know that there is a strong association with Alzheimer's and older age group individuals. Doubtlessly, these changes lead to neuronal death and brain shrinkage, inflammation, vascular damage, production of free radicals, breakdown of energy production within cells, all of which can lead to Alzheimer-like changes. It must be remembered, though, that many people live into their 90s without any signs of Alzheimer's. So everybody who hits 90 is not going to suffer from Alzheimer's disease. However, your risk is that much higher at age 90 than when you were age 45. Okay, so that is just something we need to make clear. However, although we spoke about age as an associated factor, it's not the only factor. We have genetic changes which can lead to Alzheimer's disease. We say here, although all causes of Alzheimer's disease are not yet known, there are at least 2 types of gene patterns that contribute or increases your chance of developing Alzheimer's disease. A gene called APOE4 is a major risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease. This gene is usually passed on through families. But having this gene does not necessarily mean that you'll develop Alzheimer's disease, nor does the absence of that gene mean you will never get Alzheimer's disease. So that is to say, with that gene APOE4, you're at increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. It doesn't mean you will get it, but you're at increased risk. And not having that gene does not mean that you will never develop Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so and this particular gene is passed on through families. Again, as we said earlier, if a family member has been exposed or has had Alzheimer's disease, that doesn't mean you will also develop it. It doesn't mean that. Okay, there are of course 2 different types of Alzheimer's disease: early onset Alzheimer's and late onset Alzheimer's. In early onset Alzheimer's disease, the signs first appear in a person's age between 30 and mid-60s. The disease, though, is a very rare finding in this age group. So it's rarely or hardly ever known in this young age group. Gene changes passed from parent to children is usually the cause of this early onset Alzheimer's. but it occurs for less than 10, or it accounts for less than 10% of cases of Alzheimer's. So although the gene causing or associated with Alzheimer is passed on from your parent to you, and that may cause you to develop early onset Alzheimer's between age 30 and your mid-60s, it does not contribute to the large volume of Alzheimer patients we see. It only contributes to about 10% of Alzheimer sufferers. Late onset Alzheimer's begins to appear in a person in the mid-60s. It is the more common type of Alzheimer's disease. So again, we said there are two types, early onset and late onset. Early onset contributes to about 10%. Late onset contributes to the other volume, about 90%. It may involve the gene called APOE4. Researchers, though, have not found a specific gene that directly causes late onset form of Alzheimer's disease. So although we know it is associated with APOE4, it is not specific for the disease. And there is yet to be a gene identified which directly contributes to Alzheimer. So once that gene is there, you know you're going to get Alzheimer. There's no such gene yet. The apoprotein ApoE gene on chromosome 19 increases a person's risk of Alzheimer's. Again, I'll say it does not mean that you will develop it, but with that gene, you're at increased risk. Inheriting this APO gene does not mean that a person will definitely get the disease. Some people never get the disease and some develop Alzheimer even without the gene. We talk about health, environment, and lifestyle factors. A host of factors other than genetics may play a role in the development of Alzheimer's disease. So far we talked about age, we spoke about genetic factors, but now we're talking about other factors that could contribute to the development of Alzheimer's disease. There seems to be a relationship between cognitive decline and vascular conditions. So if, for example, if you have had a stroke, if you had a heart attack, that would increase your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So we specifically say heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure, as well as metabolic diseases such as diabetes and obesity may increase your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Improving vascular health should, in theory, therefore, reduce your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So, if nothing else, if you could address any underlying health condition that challenges your cardiovascular system, diabetes, high blood pressure, even a stroke and cardiac disease can increase your risk of Alzheimer's. So if you can treat those aggressively, then that helps to stave off the possibility of developing Alzheimer's at an early stage. We talk about environmental factors, and you wonder of what significance is environmental factors and where is evidence to support environmental factors can lend itself to the cause of Alzheimer's disease. I'll tell you this, there's evidence to indicate that people in sub-Saharan Africa, as compared to Africans living in Western societies, are less likely to suffer from Alzheimer's. So people who live in sub-Saharan Africa, who live in there, are less likely to develop the disease than the same individuals who have moved over to a Western environment. So one wonders, why is that so? We're talking about the same race of people with the same genetic composition, yet just moving from one environment to another environment increases their risk of developing this condition. So let's look at potential contributing factors. We look at pollution as a factor, industrialized food, stress, sedentary lifestyles, all of those as possible contributing factors to the development of Alzheimer's. Here it is. In one small study, residents of a small Nigerian town in Africa had a lower incidence of Alzheimer's disease than the same individuals living in the USA. So one is forced to wonder, why is that so? Could the environment be playing a role? And if so, what aspects of the environment? Obviously, it's not ethnicity, because they are of the same race. It also seems crucial to suggest a critical role of the environment in the cause of this disease. So by just changing the environment from local A to local B, that is from the small Nigerian town, to bring the same individuals to the USA, they were able to develop a higher incidence of Alzheimer in the translocated group, to the USA than individuals who remained in the small Nigerian town. So you ask yourself, what factor or factors in the environment attracts this particular factor or feature? We know that the USA is a more developed country than this small town in Nigeria. So could it be that Alzheimer's disease is a disease of development? And what comes along with it? So are we saying that we're all good when we go up to the USA and we live in this industrialized country and so on, but is there a price to pay? And is that price Alzheimer's disease? I deliberately pause here to allow this to sink in. Are we paying for the price of development or living in an industrialized country through the development of Alzheimer? Let us look at the effect of development on our environment. In the developed countries, we're exposed to more heavy metals. There is lead brought into our homes through our tap water, which we drink increasingly, and as such, increase the amount of lead in our body. The long-term cumulative exposure of lead has been shown to cause a decrease in memory and progressive decline in our mental functions. In addition to lead, the role of aluminum has long been overlooked. This metal is present in many medications like antacids, the good old antacids, the suspensions, the tablets. They all have a certain level of aluminum in them. We also employ aluminum in the mercury amalgams that the dentists continue to put in our mouths as fillers for tooth defects. All these may contribute to the development of Alzheimer's. Then we talk about the mercury fillers. We highlighted earlier the fact that people who have moved from underdeveloped countries or poorly industrialized countries to more industrialized countries have an increased rate of developing Alzheimer's. We spoke about this small experiment from the Nigerian town. People moved from Nigeria to the USA and the greater incidence of Alzheimer's in that population as opposed to the population in Nigeria. And we wonder to ourselves, are we paying for the price of development? Since development is or industrialization is one of the major differences between the USA and the little tongue in Nigeria. Now, let's look at the possibility of the detrimental effects of development as far as the environment and our overall health is concerned. In the developed countries, we're exposed to more heavy metals. There is lead, which is brought into our homes through our tap water, which we drink increasingly, which leads to an increased amount of lead in our bodies. The long-term accumulative exposure to lead has been shown to cause a decrease in memory and progressive decline in our mental functions. In addition to lead, the role of aluminum has long been overlooked. This metal is present in many medications like antacids. We also employ aluminum in a variety of ways, such as the commonly used aluminum foil, which we use to cover many of our dishes. There is an increasing evidence that aluminum plays a role in the development of Alzheimer's. I hear you ask, what of mercury? Can mercury be a causative factor also? Mercury is as guilty as lead and aluminum. Where do we get mercury, you ask? For years, dentists have been using heavy metals in the form of mercury amalgams for filling our dental defects. But if that was not enough, we get a sizable portion of mercury from the fish and seafoods we ingest. A neurodegeneration appears to arise from low levels of exposure over time. So even if we get a small amount of mercury or lead or aluminum in small doses, over a time they accumulate in our bodies, leading to neurodegeneration. What of air pollution, I hear you ask? Apart from the contamination of our drinking waters and our foods with heavy metals, evidence on the role of air pollution on neurodegeneration is growing. It is evident that in developed countries as compared against developing countries, non-infectious causes are a greater cause of disease than infectious causes. Recently in the UK, one has been talking about air pollution and the need for clean air zones. There's a reason for that. It has been found that there's an association between neurodegeneration and particulate matter. Alzheimer's disease is a manifestation of neurodegenerative decline disorder. Could a neurodegenerative decline seen in Alzheimer be somehow related to particulate matter? Recent evidence tells us that particulate matter, which is defined as particles 2.5 micrograms or less, is associated with neurodegenerative diseases, specifically Alzheimer's disease and movement disorders such as Parkinson's disease. Particulate matter 2.5 angstroms or micrograms in diameter refers to tiny particles or droplets that are 2.5 microns or less in width or in diameter. Particles of the size mentioned are particularly challenging to your overall health, in that it not only leads to increasing your risk of neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's, but it can also be associated with movement disorders such as Parkinson's disease. The quality of air we breathe must be considered and needs to be improved if you share Phil Burns' academic dream of helping you reclaim your health. Obviously, you are unable to see particles of the size mentioned individually, but collectively in a confined space with a concentration of 35 micrograms per cubic meter during a 24-hour period will wreak havoc on your health. The advice therefore is to avoid poorly ventilated spaces for long periods of time, say in excess of 14 hours. What do you do? I hear you ask. No, I'm not expecting you to see particles as small as 2.5 micrograms in diameter or micrometers in diameter. Nor am I expecting you to go out and try to measure the concentration of these particles in air. These particles are too small to be seen individually by our naked eyes, but together, though they form a haze or cloud, similar to that seen from exhaust fumes, the smoke coming from chimneys, the smoke from burning bush, the smoke from cigarettes, etc. So it seems that our environment is filled with particulate matter in the developed countries, and therefore gives an explanation for the higher incidence of Alzheimer's seen in developed countries when compared with developing countries. The advice here is to avoid poorly ventilated spaces for long periods of time, say more than 14 hours, or to try to enjoy the fresh outdoors more often. Recent chatter about equality is not without precedence. We have been hearing much chatter from politicians and environmentalists about the need to improve air quality. Why the sudden awakening? Is there any significance to it? We now know the effect of prolonged exposure to particulate matter. We had exposure quoted over a 24-hour period. If we continue to be exposed to the particulate matter arising from dust from burning garden materials, from car exhaust, we are creating an environment that will cause us to become progressively sick. Not only is particulate matter able to increase our risk of neurodegenerative disease, but also increases the risk of certain types of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and respiratory illnesses. Infectious agents. We have spoken about herpes simplex type 1, the same virus associated with the development of cold sore and its potentially association with Alzheimer's disease. What? Where is the evidence, I hear you ask? Researchers have found both herpes simplex virus DNA material as well as the virus itself in the brains of people who died from Alzheimer's disease. Herpes simplex virus particles have also been found in the amyloid plaques and tau tangles in the brains of people with Alzheimer's. P. gingivalis, a bacterium in the mouth of people which tends to proliferate with poor oral hygiene, is also associated with the development of Alzheimer's disease. So too are missing teeth, with the risk increasing by 1.5% with each tooth that has been lost. Hence the advice on brushing your teeth at least twice per day and the use of dentures to help to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So what we're saying in essence is, even the simple practice of brushing your teeth regularly at least twice a day will help to stave off the potential threat of Alzheimer's. The underlying culprit we think is a bacteria we call P. gingivalis, which is associated with poor oral hygiene. So by brushing your teeth at least twice a day, you reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer as a result of this disease, as a result of this bacterium. Additionally, even if you have lost a tooth, that can increase your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. The figure quoted is 1.5% per tooth loss. So in individuals who lose one tooth, there's a 1.5% chance of them developing Alzheimer's. Two tooth is about 3% chance. 4.5%. So the risk increases with every tooth you have lost. If you use dentures, though, it seems to be protective. So if you have, say, I've lost three teeth, and you want to reduce your risk of Alzheimer's, the use of dentures may help to do just that in reducing your risk. Then we look at moles and their effects on our health. I asked the question, have you ever wondered why you feel unusually tired and almost always have a persistent headache? You generally feel unwell at home? Then you take a brief vacation, get out of the home. Almost instantaneously, you are granted renewed energy. You feel like you're your active self again. Have you been putting it down to being simply away from the commonality of life? That taking a break gives you a renewed zest for life? Alternatively, could it be because of these deadly organisms in your homes, the fungus we call mold, and the effects they have on our health? Alzheimer's disease have been reported in people after prolonged exposure to molds. So, although the evidence is not hard evidence, but there seems to be an association, so it would be to your benefit to try to avoid the exposure to molds. Because we know molds has produced toxins which has two intentions. One, to weaken the host, and two, to preserve the mold itself. So if we can avoid the exposure to molds, we'll be doing ourselves and our brains a useful service. Next, we talk about physical activity. Physical activity reduces the incidence of almost all diseases, and research shows that there is a 6-fold increased risk of developing Alzheimer's in the obese patients with high blood pressure and high cholesterol. Physical activity will reduce the incidence of Alzheimer's disease. So it's probably time to jump out there and join a gym. That will help. Okay, this is not just true to physical activity, but mental activity is also helpful. There's a decline in the incidence of Alzheimer among senior citizens who contribute to engage in brain-stimulating activities like learning new tasks, even singing and listening to music. Psychological stress leads to increased stress hormones, which have been shown to be damaging to brain functionalities. Emotional distress, such as depression and anxiety in the young and middle-aged adults have been thought to be associated with the development of Alzheimer's disease later in life. I'll say that again. If, for example, you have any mental stresses in your early life, in your younger years, that is somehow related to development of Alzheimer later in life. Therefore, there has been a lot of talk recently about mental health. This is good for your mental health, that's good for your mental health, this is bad for your mental health, that's bad for your mental health. That factor must be considered whenever we're looking at how best we can care ourselves in terms of as we get older. Because early psychological stresses, early in life, like mental health challenges, can increase your risk of developing Alzheimer's later in life. So it behooves you, therefore, to be aware of that and do whatever is necessary in order to ensure you have a very smooth and unimpacted mental health status at this juncture in your life. As you get older, the more adaptable you are to your environment, the better. The less stress, the better. So we look at psychological stresses which lead to increased stress hormones which have been shown to be damaging to brain functionality. We know that the effect of stress on various organ systems have been not always commendable. We know that stress has both a direct and an indirect effect on our cardiovascular system. It also increases the incidence of chronic health conditions such as diabetes, which is known to be associated with Alzheimer's disease. In fact, in a talk I just completed on a few days ago, we were looking at the effect of diabetes on Alzheimer's, and we actually defined Alzheimer as a type 3 diabetes because the underlying mechanism is resistance to insulin at the level of the brain. Okay? So any stress leads to the increased production of diabetes in your circulation, which leads to increased amount of insulin, which affects your cardiovascular system, which may in fact in the long run contribute to the development of Alzheimer's. So it would be helpful to you to try to address stress by employing any useful stress busters that you can come up with. I'll give you two of them: exercise, massage. Those are two simple exercises that you can get involved with that may help to reduce your stress levels. Listening to music also may help to provide you this calming influence that might help you to keep stress to a minimum. Emotional distress, such as depression and anxiety in the young and middle-aged adults, have been thought to be associated with the development of Alzheimer's disease later in life. The entity, and here it is, the broken heart syndrome, which he thought was only because a guy must have broken up with a girl, he has a broken heart. There's a real entity called the broken heart syndrome, which presents like a cardiac attack, a heart attack. All right? We'll talk more about that in our next series when we talk about cardiovascular disease. But stressful events can have a multiplicity of ill effects on your health. Alzheimer, not the only effect stress can contribute to. It contributes to diabetes, metabolic disorders, it contributes to heart disease, and a plethora of other factors, which we will talk about as we develop our discussion. This brings us to the end of Alzheimer's disease, episode 3. Here we have discussed various known causes of Alzheimer's disease. We have also hinted that all causes of Alzheimer's disease are not known. We have discussed a genetic cause for Alzheimer's disease. We discussed both early and late onset Alzheimer's disease. We looked at infectious agents, viruses, fungi, and bacteria as potential causes of Alzheimer's disease. We have looked at the role of particulate matter in the process of developing Alzheimer's disease. We have been encouraged by the attempts by politicians and environmentalists in the drive to reduce air pollution and, by extension, particulate matter in air. So with this information, I am thankful to you for your attention. Thanks.